All right, and we're live. As I already said, I'm Swanee Evans. I'm the manager of partnerships with the Council of Advanced Hunting and Shooting Sports. I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. In fact, I'm so excited about this topic, I wore my camo tie. First time breaking it out since we haven't had any conferences recently. But before we dive into introductions here and get into this content that we have teed up for you today, we're going to cover some housekeeping. Number one, we are recording. And secondly, we're going to do about 30 minutes of content. We've got a great presentation, but we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. So you're going to notice that you have a chat box at the bottom where you can chat amongst yourselves, but you also have a Q&A box. So please insert your questions that you have for our two speakers in the Q&A box, because that's the one that I will be checking. And we're going to try to hit all of those at the end, or at least as many as we can accommodate. So without further ado, we are going to be focusing on a crucial aspect of R3 today, which is how to communicate about hunting. Many of you might have been aware of or even participated in a debate workshop that was conducted in Washington, D.C. back in May of 2019 that was put together by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Hunters Leadership Forum, and Responsive Management that focused on debating and communicating about hunting. It was a great introduction into what we're going to be talking about today. But today we have Mark Duda, who's the Executive Director of Responsive Management. I'm sure if you haven't met him, you're familiar with him. He's led the firm since its inception in 1990 and conducted over 1,000 studies on how people relate to natural resources in the outdoors. And then we have Peter Churchbourne, who is the Director of NRA Hunters Leadership Forum. He's been doing some great things, have been putting out a lot of press about R3, and he's heading up these efforts. So they're going to cover the highlights of the new book, How to Talk About Hunting, Research-Based Communication Strategies. It was authored by Mark, and then it's a product of the NRA Hunters Leadership Forum. So it focuses on the most persuasive and compelling ways to communicate about hunting to non-hunters and those unfamiliar with hunting. So we're really looking forward to jumping into it, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is the screen up?
Yep, we are good to go.
Okay, good. That actually is always the hardest and most nerve-wracking part in this day and age on whether the technology works. So thank you very much, Swanee. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Damian Duda. I'm the Executive Director of Responsive Management. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. It looks like we're over 100 people, so that is just fantastic. Really appreciate it. I'd like to thank the Council to Advance the Hunting and Shooting Sports for hosting this, and my colleague Peter Churchbourne, who's going to talk in a few minutes about the project as well. But I'd like to introduce you to a new book that's being printed as we speak called How to Talk About Hunting, Research-Based Communication Strategies. And I'd like to quickly point out that words matter. Words matter. And I'm just going to bring some things up first outside of our profession and then maybe go into a little bit on our profession. But I want you to think about some things that you hear every day that you might not think about sort of in depth. But think about some of these different ways of talking about essentially the same thing. Think about pro-life versus pro-choice. Same thing, but certainly putting a positive spin from both sides. Illegal alien versus undocumented worker. Wow, what different connotations those two words on either way to frame that resonate and sound. We used to have something called an estate tax that was reframed by people who did not like that tax to the death tax. Think which one resonates more in eliciting negativity toward, in some ways, sort of a neutral sounding estate tax. Bringing it closer to home, think about assault rifle versus modern sporting rifle. Two ways of framing what some people might think is the same thing, and those elicit very different emotions. But let's bring it closer to home. Let's think about trophy hunting versus hunting for meat. A lot of us go for big animals at this time of year. Is that trophy hunting, or we're eating it? We eat a lot of venison. Is it hunting for meat? Well, as you know, who've followed my work over the past 30 years, is I can get about 80 to 85% support for hunting for meat. I can get about 28 to 30% support for trophy hunting. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Let's talk about, now you hear more and more the term legal regulated hunting. Well, that term started a long time ago, 35 plus years, in some original research that we did when we saw that it was all across the board when we started measuring Americans' attitudes toward hunting. Saw 30% support, 80% support. What in the world was going on? Well, in a focus group we did in as early as the 1980s, it's a long time ago, 1980s, we found that people would say, well, you know, I don't support hunting because I don't support poaching of rhinos in Africa. And, you know, when you started looking at it, we were like, well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about legal regulated hunting in the US, deer hunting, duck hunting. And people would say, oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, I get it. Well, the point here is that words matter. Words matter. And cultural support for hunting matters as well. This is a group of R3 experts and R3 professionals. This is a group of people that cares about hunting participation, laws and regulations. But none of that can take place until we have that cultural support for hunting. Everything stems from cultural support for hunting, as well as serving as sort of an umbrella to help us shield all of those things that we care so much about. And it really comes down to something that was said probably 2,000 years ago. A number of people have been attributed to that more recently. And that is, well, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. Don't raise your voice, improve your argument. When it comes to us teaching hunters about hunting techniques, we do an amazing job. And I've used every one of these books. My favorite probably for me is the Wild Turkey Hunting. We have an enormous number of communications, information, education strategies. This is one that's really important. This is the NRA's Hunter Skills Series that have been around since my recollection is the late 1980s. And a lot of these people have read these on this webinar right now. Well, about 3 or 4 years ago, I sort of had the idea that while we're doing a great job in teaching people how to hunt, ethical aspects of it, we didn't do such a good job in teaching people how to talk about and how to defend hunting. And so Peter and I schemed. We did a number of projects at that point and ended up with this book called How to Talk About Hunting. So for a few minutes here, let me turn it over to Peter and let him talk about the project as well. Peter was great in this project, helping shepherd through things, keeping things on time. So Peter, why don't I turn it over to you for a few minutes, please?
Great. Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. Appreciate you coming on and checking out our project. First, I want to thank the council for this opportunity. This is a great forum and a great way for us to test some of the upcoming seminars that we want to do. We're going to figure out the best avenue of how we can get everyone together virtually and share some of this information in a more detailed form. So thank you, Swanee, Samantha, for having us on. And I want to thank Mark. Mark has gone above and beyond the call of duty in this project. It is a labor of love for both of us. Our both our minds of how we wanted to see this project come off started about 3 years ago. So we're so happy that we were able to do this. And Mark, thank you very much for the amazing amount of time that you and your uncompensated amount of time that you and your put into this project. I know that you've gone deep into the hole for us, so thank you very much. But I know you believe in it. Tell everyone really quick about the Hunters Leadership Forum. It's relatively new, probably to most of you. It's been around for about 5 years. It's a fundraising initiative that started in the NRA about 5 years ago to put a bunch of like-minded individuals together that were willing to support some high-level thinking research initiatives that we wanted to do at the NRA. So we've been very lucky. We're very fortunate to be supported by a lot of the industry, and then about 150 individual donors who have given their hard-earned dollars to support this effort. Some of it has gone into an endowment, which will be around for forever, and we will use the interest off of that. And some of it has gone into a cash fund that we've used to pay for this research. So that's how we're funding this, and that's how we're able to print this book and send it out for free. The majority of that money that's been given goes into our foundation, which is 501c3. So that's how we're able to support this educational program. So there is great value to this research, and there's great value to this book. So don't think that there's not because it's free. We've just been very fortunate with philanthropic-minded people that wanted to donate to this project. So thank you to all of them as well. A little bit about the project, but real quick, Mark. You know, this has been the thought, the idea behind what we're going to talk about today and in the book has been on Mark and I's mind for many years. And then it wasn't until we did the research on the Americans' attitudes towards the animal rights movement and hunting that a lot of the information came out and became so obvious about what we needed to do, and it was the right timing. All the great effort that a lot of people on this call do for R3, which is extremely important, and we won't be able to keep hunting going in this country without getting new people involved and bringing back the same old people and keeping people around. But this information that we're going to give out in this book is a partner to that. So I hope you enjoy it. We'll talk at the end about how you get a copy of it for you, your friends, your people at work. But I think it's going to help everyone a lot. Okay, thanks a lot. Mark, take it away.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So let's talk about the book itself. How to talk about hunting, research-based communication strategies. As Swanee said, I was able to be the author on this, but we had a lot of help. Peter's project management, a number of staff at Responsive Management were involved, as well as some of the illustrations in it. It was kind of interesting. I actually went back to one of the artists that did some artwork on one of my first books about 35 years ago, named Todd Thielander. One of the people that was really important in this project is a gentleman that you all met who came to our workshop in May 15th of 2019, Dr. Samuel Nelson. Sam is a professor at Cornell University, and he's the director of the #1 debate team in the US. We were working with him on the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation project, and because of the funding from Peter and the Hunters Leadership Forum, we're able to hire him back into even more depth about how to talk about hunting and to give us some really ideas, points, talked to me and had some great workshops with him, private workshops, to help develop some of the concepts in here. But he's an amazing person. Again, never debate with somebody from Cornell because you'll probably lose, and you'll probably lose because of Sam's tips. That's the bad news. The good news is that he shared a lot of the stuff with us and worked with us as well. So while I get to be the author on it, this is the work of a lot of different people. So thanks. The book contains 11 different chapters. And for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to go through sort of the top line things in each of those chapters. Why public opinion on hunting matters, why words matter, a chapter on participation in hunting, attitudes toward hunting, a chapter on animal rights and animal welfare, which I think is one of the most important, arguing for hunting, strategies that work, and words that don't. We're going to talk a little bit about participation in sport shooting and the reasons I included that, attitudes towards sport shooting, a chapter on how to debate formally about hunting, a chapter on how to develop formal communications programs, and the final chapter on don'ts and do's. The first chapter is really an introduction, and I think it's important. I'm not going to talk about a lot of it here because this is sort of an abbreviated overview, but I think it's important to make a few points. First, we talk about hunting. We recruit hunters. A lot of us do it because we love it. It's what we do. It's what we love to do professionally. It's important to us from a value standpoint. But I think it's really important to point out that we do this. Every state fish and wildlife agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, are legislatively mandated to manage and provide for hunting opportunities. I think that's pretty important. We're not talking about skateboarding or horseback riding or other recreational activities. We are legally obligated to provide opportunities for hunting. That's why everybody has a hunting regulation manual. That's why your commissions get together every month or every 2 months and talk about hunting regulations and rules. This is something that we're legally obligated to do. That's on the policy and planning side of things. But think how important it is too from an evolutionary standpoint. Man, women have been hunting for almost 2 million years. 1.7 million years is what the estimates from the Smithsonian Institution are. 1.7 million years. We've probably been hunting as a species for about 99.9% of our tenure here on Earth. But yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of all the positives, hunting remains vulnerable to volatile nature of public opinion. We saw that with Cecil the lion. We see that with hunting bans or attempted hunting bans in your states with votes and issues like that. We see that sometimes in our commission meetings. We're trying to institute a bear hunt or whatever. So hunting remains vulnerable to the volatile nature of public opinion, and it behooves us a million times to know how to talk about hunting. Well, why does hunting matter? Well, you all, the 100+ people that are involved here, know why it matters. You know why it matters from a historical, a contemporary context. You know how hunters help fund wildlife conservation. And in this first chapter, we talk about all of those issues because this book was written for you in a lot of the chapters, but we also wrote this book for legislators or for communications experts that we might hire that might not know a lot about hunting, but know a lot about communications that need that background. We may sometimes need those quick facts when we talk about hunting to remind ourselves all of the things that hunters do to help fund conservation, the work that funds wildlife restoration programs. I mean, essentially hunters and anglers are funding about 50,000 staff members across state fish and wildlife agencies, the money that they donate, all of the species that we've brought back from the Rocky Mountain elk, wood duck. I mean, all these species that around 1900 were in rough condition. We also talk about the whole idea of how to shape public opinion and attitudes. As many of you know, I was involved as a co-investigator in the Colorado State University's wildlife values study. It was a great honor to be involved with that. And we know that America's wildlife values are changing. We also know one of the things that's so important is that sometimes we just want to shove information down people's throats. You know, if you only knew this, if they only knew that. But one of the things that we know certainly from a lot of research is that just information does not just change people's attitudes. There's more to it. And one of the more important aspects that we go into is this whole idea of motivation. And research shows that motivation rather than information is really the key to change attitudes and behaviors. And what I mean by that is those shared values that we have about saving habitat, desire to maintain wildlife populations versus focusing just on hunting, sort of the difference between the means and the end of that. So we get into that in a little bit of depth in chapter 1. One of the things that I want to point out is in the book that there's a lot in each chapter. The book's over about 250 pages, but we wanted to boil it down to its very essence. So in every one of the chapters with information, except the last chapter, we talk about don'ts and do's, we end with key takeaways. So if you don't have time to read the book, you can go straight to the key takeaways. You would miss a lot of information and background information, but certainly hit the highlights of each chapter. I started out with this, and I'm not going to go into it again, but again, it's not what you say. It's not the words that you say, it's what people hear. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. And I talked about those different ways of talking about different issues outside of our profession to bring you in to our profession in terms of how we talk about things, but as importantly and most importantly, what people hear. And what they hear when they talk about hunting is different when they hear about trophy hunting versus hunting for meat or legal regulated hunting. Words matter. Words matter. The next chapter is participation in hunting. And I'm not going to talk about this a lot. We've got 20 minutes or so to talk about all of the book. But again, the book was written for you all, the 100+ people who were on this, but also for legislators, communications experts, and people who might not know those numbers like you and I do. We talk about all of the different numbers that have been put forth in terms of hunting. Oh, there's 11.5 million hunters. No, there's really 20 million hunters. Well, there's a reason for those numbers. And if you start talking about hunting, if you debate hunting, if you're communicating about hunting, you need to know the differences in terms of where those numbers come from. And you can see on the right all of the different issues that we talk about. A lot of the work that we've done over the past 30 years on hunting initiation, and then a lot of stuff on participation by species, equipment, motivations, the economic contributions, as well as the threats to hunting. And I think this chapter was very important because if you're talking about hunting and you're debating hunting, or someone else is saying, well, I heard this or I heard that, we need to know the facts. And so the facts are all in one place on participation in hunting, and they live in chapter 3. Chapter 4 is a lot of the work that we've done over the past 30 years on attitudes toward hunting. For those of you who've heard me speak at the North American, the AFWA conferences, you've seen our work on approval of hunting and how that varies by species, by method and motivation. I'm convinced I could write a spreadsheet and you could tell me what the species was, what the method was, and I could tell you what the support and opposition is for that. But it matters, and it matters how to talk about it, especially it matters what people hear. We talk about trends in hunting approval. I spend a great deal of time, actually, maybe 6, 7, or 8 pages in the book on what I called untangling and addressing trophy hunting. Trophy hunting, those two words are an anti-hunter's best friend, not because of what it really is, but because of what it connotates in someone's mind. And there's a big difference there. And I can't talk about it a lot because we don't have enough time, but it's important to understand when we talk about hunting for a trophy and all of the emotions and such that elicits. In fact, in focus groups, if you talk about trophy hunting, what do people think? Oh, it's the rich white guy going out and shooting the best animal, depleting the population and cutting the head off, leaving the rest to waste and putting it up on his wall only to think what a big, cool, great person he is and feed his ego. Well, you know what? That's not what trophy hunting is, but that's what people hear. It's really important to decipher that and talk about it in ways that people need to. We have a section there on attitudes toward hunting among youth. that's really important in the up and coming people. There's lots of graphs, and hopefully we boiled a lot of that down in terms of things that are easy to read and easy to comprehend. The next chapter is probably the most important chapter on attitudes toward animal rights, animal welfare, and dominionism. And let's talk about that for a minute, because sometimes you'll see these surveys and it'll show 70% of Americans, 80% of Americans agree with animal rights. Wow. And then you see a headline, animal rights, people support that? Well, they don't really know the definition of it, because when you ask them to choose on whether animals have rights like humans and should not be used in any way, a true animal rights perspective, you only get about 14%. Animals can be used by humans as long as the animal does not experience undue pain and suffering. 82% of Americans agree with that. And only 4% agree with that other side of that continuum. Animals can be used by humans regardless of the animal's welfare or rights. Man, that is really important stuff when it comes to talking about hunting. So let's take a look at what that continuum looks like. On the left, you've got animal rights. You can't use animals. On the far right over there, you've got dominionism. You can use animals, and it doesn't matter if they experience undue pain or suffering. You can just use them the way you want. And in the middle, remember that number, 80% plus, say, well, we can utilize animals, but you need to be aware of the animal's pain and suffering. You can use them, but we want to minimize that pain and suffering. And this is where the argument is won and lost when it comes to talking about hunting. If we talk about kill them and grill them, if it flies, it dies, kill that son of a bitch, man, we lose everybody. We lose everybody. And I want you to think about what animal rights people do. People don't fund animal rights programs and $200 million budgets by saying you can't eat meat. 93% of Americans eat meat. Nobody's going to give to that. What do they talk about? They talk about stopping pain and suffering. And what they do is they utilize an animal welfare perspective to fund animal rights. It's really important because the middle ground is where we will win. Again, we're going to lose people on that dominionism side. And that's why in the middle, we talk about practicing legal and ethical and regulated hunting. We may even talk about how hunters respect animals and pray for those animals. We talk about ensuring sustainable wildlife populations. And we talk about practicing hunting so we don't wound animals. And we utilize animals while working to minimize their pain and suffering. That's where the arguments are won and lost. And everything you do and everything you talk about hunting should be seen through this prism of animal rights, animal welfare, and dominionism. It's incredibly important. The next chapter is on arguing for hunting, what works and what doesn't. And we know when it comes to this, there's a lot of opinions about this. In fact, if you look at the animal rights people, they've got about, in totality, animal rights, people who are arguing against hunting, and people who are arguing for hunting. We were able to isolate about 81 arguments, 81 separate arguments for and against hunting. What works? What doesn't? And so we spent about a year and a half over the past couple of years, and this was funded through Hunters Leadership Forum, talking to 15,000 Americans, doing a survey of 15,000 Americans on what resonates and what doesn't. What are the arguments that they say, you know, okay, I get it. I'm moving up the scale there. I support hunting more than I did before I heard that message. Versus, hey, if you hear this, oh yeah, you know, you're right. That I could be against hunting if I keep hearing that. And so what we did is we tested these 81 different arguments, for and against hunting. And it comes down to only a few things. If you talk about hunting, we need to focus on hunting as a food source, hunting as conservation, and hunting as a right. You might have a pet argument. Take a look in the book and see where it falls. Is it number 1 or is it number 50? Well, it just makes sense that we focus in on the ones that work. What should you be afraid of? You should be afraid of 3 arguments that work against hunting. Hunting as a violation of fair chase, hunting being linked to trophy hunting, and hunting results in diminished wildlife populations. Wow, guess what? Those are pretty easy to counter. And we do that in the book in terms of that. You don't need to read this book to counter those arguments, but you need to be aware of them. And the average person out there, the average legislator, communicator, needs to know what the arguments are and how to respond. And then finally in this chapter, there's lots of other arguments that we give you the facts for and how to rebut. If you Google who funds wildlife conservation, some really negative things are going to come up. And we rebut those because we know that that's not true, but it's out there. If you Google it, there's some papers that were funded by anti-hunters that come up pretty darn high in that search engine. And you can see the other ones about non-lethal methods replacing hunting. Well, they don't, but people need to know the facts. They need to know the facts about when anti-hunters say that hunting older and larger animals damage the genetic pool. Well, we know they don't, and we give the facts to that. We also see arguments that say hunting leads to sociopathic behavior. And what they do essentially is they put some research together that shows that, that really bad people harm animals when they're young, but that's very different than hunting. And we present data that shows the 2 + 2 that the anti-hunters make as 10 versus destroying that argument that hunting, of course, does not lead to sociopathic behavior, and quote studies that show that, most prominently by a woman named Dr. Ann Causey from, I believe, Auburn University. She got her PhD, I think, at Georgia University, and Swanee did not pay me to say that. So let's talk about Chapter 7 quickly in terms of participation in shooting. We know sports shooting and firearms ownership is increasing dramatically. That's important from a funding standpoint. There's lots of good things and lots of things we need to be concerned about that. We know that about 40% of households have firearms in them. We know sports shooting is absolutely on the rise, but we know that that's changing the balance of funding. And it's also important because we need to know about sports shooting. Sports shooting is becoming very important from a funding perspective. I'm not sure if anybody was on here, but last week I had the honor of being the keynote speaker for the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation's annual meeting. And I went into that a little bit because, again, I think it's important. I think it's something that we're going to have to grapple with over the next few years. I have a chapter on attitudes towards sport shooting. I'm not going to talk much about it here because it's in the book. And we've got a lot of trend data on that, on the work that we've done with NSSF over the years. Chapter 9, one of my favorites in terms of debating about hunting. Sometimes we're dragged on stage. Sometimes we have to debate anti-hunters. We should debate anti-hunters. But if you go in without the proper training, without the proper way of debating, you are going to get your ass kicked. You will get your ass kicked. And I've seen that because I've trained people over the years and I've studied most of the debates that have been out there. And so the anti-hunters are quite skilled at it. In fact, some of the debates we looked at when, just a guy got up there and he was going to debate about hunting, and he's an anti-hunter, guy turned out to be the national champion debater. So you going in and debating someone like that is essentially you playing basketball against Michael Jordan. I mean, you're going to lose. And so in this chapter, we talk about all of the ways and all of the things that you need to do and how to act and how to speak in terms of debating about hunting. You need 3 things to start out with. You need credibility. You need to talk with emotion and show people that you care. And you need to have that logic. Man, that's pretty good. You know what? one of the smartest guys in the world called that ethos, pathos, and logos. Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, talked about the importance when it comes to communications and debating. If you don't have all three, you probably will lose that debate. We're really good when it comes to factual reasons, but sometimes we're not as good with emotion and showing how much we care about wildlife to people. And you can see the other points on the right as we go into in depth about the things that you can do to debate and win debates and win communications arguments. We hired, as we talked about, the Cornell guys to go in and watch these debates. We watched tons of debates, and they came back with certain things. They should have done this here. Those guys should have done this. They should have done this. Look what the anti-hunters did here. Look what we did here. This is what we should have done. This is what they are doing. Some incredible work by our friends at Cornell who talked to us and showed us what we were doing right. When I say we, it wasn't me, it was collectively wildlife professionals over the past 3 decades when we got tangled with anti-hunters. The final chapter in this part of it is developing formal communications programs. More and more states are setting up formal communications programs in support of hunting. You see that in Colorado, you see that in Michigan. And so over the past 30 years, we've helped a lot of agencies develop formal programs, sometimes just not in support of hunting, but endangered species or agency relevancy or whatever it is. And there are certain step-by-step processes that you have to take to become more effective. And in this chapter, we identify what those step-by-step are in order to develop a more effective program. How to identify information and education needs, how to define goals and set measurable objectives, how to get the message across, how to evaluate properly. And another cool part of this is we did a number of case studies. We looked at the Nimrod Society, the Colorado Wildlife Council that's been doing a great job in terms of developing support for hunting. Right now, as we speak, we're doing research for the Michigan Wildlife Council to see how their programs are affecting attitudes in Michigan. These are formal programs. Some work we did with the Louisiana Alligator Management Program. And of course, everyone knows the great work that RBFF is doing in increasing participation. And finally, everything leads up to the last chapter, chapter 11, on the don'ts and the do's. We have more than 60 individual guidelines on what to do, what to say, and what not to say, and how to say it, and your tone, and everything else. And you can see I'm being really bad because that's blank, because I'm going to make you read the book, or at least go to that chapter to see what it is that we talked about. Now, the book is called How to Talk About Hunting. How to Talk About Hunting. But the sub is research-based communication strategies. This is stuff that I didn't make up. This is not Mark Duda saying, oh, say this, do this. This is research-based from A to Z. Everything in there that we talk about is footnoted, and there's 26 pages of endnotes and references. How to talk about hunting, but possibly more important, their research-based communication strategy. It's not just some guy making this stuff up. It's based on the research. It's what the research tells us. So that's a very brief overview on that. You can see my email, but as Peter said, to order copies of the book, if you would send your name and address, and most importantly, your address, because a lot of us are working from home right now, and we want to get this into your hands. So with that, I really appreciate everybody tuning in. When we first started talking about this, I figured there'd be about 8 or 10 people on, and I know that over 100 people signed up, so it's really, I really appreciate that, and it shows your interest. So thank you everyone so much for listening, and and really an honor to be able to take part of your day up. So with that, let me turn that over to Swanee.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. That was great. We've got a few questions rolling in here that we're going to hit. I am going to kill your screen share, Mark, here for a minute. And we're going to run through these. But first, I've got to ask you. So I know you said you're going to wait and make us read the book, but could you hit on just a couple of those individual guidelines that you referenced for the do's and don'ts?
I can. Couple of them. One of the things that we write in there that I think is really important is that promoting hunting is not a matter of dramatically changing most Americans' hearts and minds. Rather, it's about affirming core values that they already have about meat consumption, about the use of animals, about conservation, about family and friends, and ethics, and bring to the forefront widely held opinions and attitudes toward hunting. So I think it's really important. You know, hunters already have the facts on their side. We know that most of the American public consents to the use of animals, provided that animals do not experience undue pain and suffering. And so some of the things we talk about is the tone of discussion, being positive. Sometimes so many people, and this is why actually, Swati, I didn't talk about it because I don't want to just think people to go, oh, that's all you're saying, because we have 60 of these, but you asked, so I'll give you sort of a Reader's Digest version. But we talk about the tone of discussion, about being patient with Americans. I've done about $100 million worth of research over the past 30 years on how people relate to wildlife. Never have I done a study that really shows that any kind of substantial amount of people don't like wildlife. And so those common core values are incredibly important. Now, with that said, that people care about wildlife, and I've been made fun of my whole life probably, but people say, oh, Mark says people care about wildlife. Well, they do. Look at the ballot initiatives that come out. 75 to 80% of ballot initiatives, green ballot initiatives, pass. 75 or 80%. People care about wildlife. Now, with all of that said, people don't know diddly. I mean, people do not know a whole lot about wildlife. Man, I got really scared that my mute button was on and I was sitting there and nobody could hear me. So people care, but they don't know a lot. We need to be patient. We need to remember that whole idea of ethos, pathos, and logos. We need to focus in on the core values that people have. Remember, motivation is more important than the facts. If I talk to you about, hey, let's talk about how hunting is a medium, is a means to the end of saving habitat, of saving and preserving wildlife conservation, that's really effective of focusing in on motivation. I talk about viewing all communications through the animal rights, animal welfare perspective. I talk about how peer influence matters. Peer influence matters. I briefly went over, and you all have seen over the years, when I talk that 79% of Americans support legal regulated hunting. But that really varies based on males, rural areas, and down way on the bottom, Hispanic, blacks, females. I mean, that varies pretty dramatically. So, wow, Mark's really smart. He showed the whole hunting community that white rural males are the most supportive of hunting. God, you're a genius, right? So, well, yeah, that's pretty important. But here's something that's even more important. You know what trumps all of those? Knowing a hunter. Knowing a hunter, the very top of the list. So we need to talk about hunting. So peer group is important. We've seen that with adults and with kids. And now you've asked for some, so I've given you some. I've got a lot more. But here's another important one. Tell stories. We know from the literature, we know from common sense, how incredibly important it is for people to tell stories, to tell those personal stories about being in a blind with your kids, or those really cool stories that we put up wood duck boxes or whatever it is that we did. I could give you some really cool things about a turkey that Peter Churchbourne and I were after for days and never found him. But I can slip in there some really cool facts to all of a sudden you're like, wow, that hunting sounds pretty cool. I thought it was just the rich guy shooting an animal and leaving its whole body and taking its head. I'm being superlative here, but there's lots of things that we talk about in there. So those are just some. I could go on and on, but I know we're.
So that was a great point about knowing a hunter, and that just kind of shows the importance of communication tactics like this and focusing on what we as professionals communicate out, but also what we encourage our existing hunting participant base to communicate, because they are on the front lines and they're the ones that are interacting with everybody and changing opinions or reinforcing negative opinions.
Yeah. Let me hit one more, if I will, because I think this is an important one. This is a finding that I've seen for years that just knocks my socks off. But when we talk about Americans' attitudes toward wildlife, one of the questions that I've had, and sort of everybody needs to put down their coffee cup on this one, but we asked over the years, we've asked this question. We did it for the Hunters Leadership Forum, but that it was a question on, do you agree or disagree that hunting as practiced in the US today can cause some species to become threatened, endangered, or extinct? And about 45% of Americans agree with that. I mean, think of the gravity of that's the basic that you're working from, that more people think that hunting, that legal regulated hunting, can cause species to decline.
Yeah.
And that, how frustrating might be the best word to know that we're the ones who brought back the wood duck, the antelope, the Rocky Mountain elk, the white-tailed deer, the wild turkey. I mean, the numbers are incredible. And yet that's Americans' level of knowledge. Well, you might never even think of communicating that because it's such a given. But yet that should be part of our verbal repertoire when talking to people. And not talking down to people, but sharing those facts with people. Wow, you guys went out for turkey hunting? That's really cool. I can tell you some fun stories. I can make you smile. But I can also tell you at the turn of the century, there were not a lot of turkeys around. And now there's upwards of 7 million. That's pretty exciting. But it's also a great tactic to say, here's ways that I'm bringing in terms of increasing your support for hunting.
Absolutely. So Tom Decker's got a really interesting question here, and I think it's a great one to talk about as far as how all of this is framed when we have this information available. But he says that he's concerned about the narrative in terms of effective communication and the quote, win debates and arguments, or arguments for and against, whereas most of our communications programs are not about debating, winning, or improving arguments. He's saying you don't win your way into cultural acceptance or relevance. R3 communication is not about winning arguments. He thinks it's about context and narrative. For example, hunting for food is widely accepted, as you mentioned, Mark, but we mostly report fall hunting in terms of deer or elk killed this year, up or down from last year. Many members of the public don't know that those animals are utilized for food. We don't report these animals as meals, which people eat every day. So he's wondering if you can comment on that context.
Yeah, well, of course. Hopefully he's not just focusing in on one of 11 chapters. One chapter in that book talks about formal debates. That's one of dozens of ways that we communicate with the public. So so of course the book's not just on debating hunting. If that's what he heard, maybe I didn't do as good a job as I should have in talking about, but we have 11 chapters in that book. And a lot of those chapters are devoted to everyday communications. So that's where it's like, no, well, I know Tom. So Tom, no, of course it's not. And the other thing he's pointing that is a good point is that you don't go up and you don't win, you don't win an argument. You don't win an argument. You don't win an argument formally except in a debate type strategy. And I would say that anybody who's married knows that. Wife, husband, I'm going to debate you. Well, I was right and you were wrong. Of course not. There are subtle ways to get people to support hunting. And that's what this book is about. And that's what those strategies are about. One chapter is about debating. 10 chapters are in how to talk and how to communicate about hunting to do one thing, to move them from either not supporting hunting or being on the road, on the neutral side of things, to the road to increase support for hunting. So now with all of that said, Tom's point about how we communicate is incredibly important. I mean, I hope this book makes us step back and see what messages that people are hearing, because Tom is right on track when it comes to that. If we're putting out numbers this year, we do a lot of the harvest studies for the states. This year, we killed 175,000 deer. Somebody sees that, it's like, holy shit, it took, 250,000 deer in this state? God, it's just carnage. So his point on that is right on target. Step outside and go back to the public and hear what kinds of messages people are hearing from the public. So great point.
Absolutely. And the food messaging is ever increasing in our community, which I think is great. One interesting thing that Montana did a while back is they started reporting their harvest in terms of meat, the pounds of meat, instead of the number of animals harvested, which was a very interesting graphic that I saw come out. I don't know what the impact of that was, but it had an impact on me. That's for sure.
It's a great, and let me follow up on that. I mean, another tactic that we talk about, again, in 50 minutes, I can't tell you everything that's in there, but from a research perspective, we all have neighbors, or if you don't, you're lucky, and I want to come out and visit and hunt on your property. But most of us have neighbors, and those neighbors see us in our camo coming back from a hunt or whatever. We're unpacking the decoys. One of the things, we can do one of two things. We can go talk to them, or we can share some of that game. And we know from research, from our research, from published research that other people have done, that if you really want to turn someone from maybe being negative or neutral toward hunting to support hunting, have them share some of the animals that you've killed. Bring them a turkey breast, bring them backstrap meat. And man, it's hard to argue when you eat a great meal like that. And it's like, hey, next time you go, would you bring me a little more? There's lots of ways that we can do that. And again, this book is holistic and in totality. It's not just about winning a debate.
Yeah, Hank Forrester with National Deer Association always calls it venison diplomacy. I think he stole it from Steve Burnella, but I'll credit him with it.
Great, that's a great statement.
Let's jump into a couple of others. Here we have just a few minutes left. A couple of quick notes. We have some comments about sharing meals, as you mentioned, Mark, and then Samantha pointed out as well, Shane Mahoney's been working on the Wild Harvest Initiative that focuses on that wild game consumption as well. And she put a link in the chat and you can check it out down there. So we have another question here from an attendee that says, how many women and Black, Indigenous people of color in the hunting realm reviewed and or provided input on the text or context of the book?
Yeah, great. We had several, we had a lot. We're working actually on a project right now on women in hunting with Dr. Christine Thomas. And so we've definitely gotten a lot of input. In fact, when I did a workshop several years ago in Rome on hunting, it was actually for the European Union and such. Every single one of my colleagues were females. So absolutely. From a Black perspective, we've had a lot of input as well. For 30 years, we've been conducting research on how, African Americans, now Blacks, think about hunting and how they talk about hunting. Some of you have heard me say something that I think is incredible. Other people have used it over the years, but when I was doing a study on African Americans, in this case, it was fishing participation, why African Americans did not fish at the rates that whites did. We went literally around the US and talked to African Americans, every night of the week for 3 weeks. And that was 30 years ago. And I remember a lot of that, and we've incorporated a lot of that research into what we do. But one particular African-American woman said something that stuck with me for 30 years. She said, you buy things that look like you. Mark, you buy things that look like you. And we take it for granted now that if we want African-Americans, females to hear our message, we need to use them in images and models. You buy things that look like you. But 30 years ago, that wasn't the case. So anyway, so it was a great question. Whoever had that question, I know it was Hank or whoever had it, I can assure you that we talked to enormous numbers of females, as well as Blacks, African-Americans, Hispanics, as well as in our research. So great question, and we've got you covered on that.
Perfect. We're going to hit one more here, and then we're about to run up on our 4 o'clock time wall. As we recruit people from so many different backgrounds, will or do the messages that worked in the past, are they going to work in the future? What do you think about that?
Great. We actually have a sub-chapter related to that entire thing. And that is that there's publics, not a public. And so when we talk about messages, there are some overriding messages, but depending on the audience, you need to tailor your message. It's kind of a duh, right? I mean, of course we do. But we have cross-tabulated out what messages are going to resonate with different groups. So great question. And, you know, at some point we need an overriding message. And that's where those overriding messages of food, of conservation, of hunting, not depleting animals, those were commonalities. But then you'll start to see subtle differences in there as well. So great question, and we've got that covered as well.
Absolutely. For the food, conservation, and you said the right to hunt as well. That is a human
right to hunt. Yep.
Perfect. I think that's a great way to end it. Mark, if you'll tell us one more time, or maybe Peter, about how to get access to this book, and then we'll hang it up from there.
Perfect. Let me share my screen and people can write it down or take a picture of it. I'm a crappy writer, and so you can take it. Sometimes what I do to cheat is I actually take a picture of the screen. So that's Peter and I's information.
Perfect. So thanks again, Mark and Peter. We really appreciate you coming on here and talking about this. I'm looking forward to reading through that comprehensive research there. And everybody here, please feel free to reach out to Mark with any questions, or hit Peter to get a copy of that book. I know I've already sent him an email myself, and I appreciate everybody jumping on today. This is going to be up on our YouTube channel if you want to review it or go back to look at any of the information, and we'll throw up a post on the National R3 community to link to that once we have uploaded it. Good. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.